She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't drop her phone or collapse against the marble pillar holding her upright. She just stood there, 20 feet away, watching her husband brush the hair from her best friend's face like it was the most natural thing in the world. 5 years of excuses. 5 years of board meetings and emergency calls and cold dinners eaten alone. 5 years of telling herself she was paranoid. She wasn't paranoid. She was betrayed by the two people she loved most. If this story hits you somewhere deep, like every silent, a woman who's ever swallowed her pain whole, stay until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started like every other Saturday Vivian Hale had lived through in the last 2 years, quiet in all the wrong ways. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind of quiet you choose when the house is finally yours for a few hours, and you pour yourself coffee and sit by the window and breathe. No, this was the other kind. The kind that fills rooms after someone has stopped trying to fill them with conversation. The kind that settles into the walls and the furniture and the spaces between two people who used to have too much to say to each other and now have nothing at all. Adrian had left early. He always left early on Saturdays now. Vivian had watched him dress from the bed, her eyes half open, tracking his movements in the gray morning light. He moved with that particular efficiency of a man who has somewhere he wants to be. Sharp, contained, no wasted motion. He didn't ask if she was awake. He didn't kiss her forehead like he used to, back when that gesture still meant something. He just buttoned his shirt at the mirror, checked his phone twice, and walked out. The bedroom door closed with a soft click. She lay there for a long time after, staring at the ceiling. Then she got up, got dressed, and decided to do something kind. That was Vivian's problem, maybe. She kept trying to do kind things for a man who had stopped deserving them. She'd seen the watch 3 weeks ago, a vintage Patek Philippe in a glass case on the second floor of Marchetti's on 5th, the kind of timepiece that serious men wore when they wanted to signal to other serious men that they had arrived. Adrian had mentioned it once, just once at dinner months back, and she'd filed it away the way she filed away everything about him. Carefully, quietly, the way a woman does when she's still hoping that paying attention is enough to save something. She told herself it was an anniversary gift. Early. Their 6th anniversary was still 2 months out, but she wanted to do it now, wanted to feel like she was trying, wanted to carry something home to him that said, I still see you, I still know you, I'm still here. She took the Bentley, Adrian's second car, the one he never drove anymore, and headed downtown. The shopping district on 5th and Callaway was exactly what it always was on a Saturday. Beautiful people in expensive coats moving between storefronts like they had nothing to prove and all the time in the world to prove it. Vivian moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had spent years learning how not to draw attention to herself. That was another thing marriage to Adrian Viscari had taught her. Stay quiet. Stay small. Don't make scenes. She was 20 feet from Marchetti's when she saw them. She stopped walking. Her body made the decision before her mind did. Some survival reflex, some animal part of her brain that understood what her conscious self wasn't ready to process yet. She stepped to the left, behind a wide marble pillar outside the jeweler's next door, and she just stopped. Adrian was across the street. He was not in a board meeting. He was not handling an emergency. He was laughing. Open-mouthed, genuine, the way Vivian hadn't heard him laugh in 2 years. The kind of laugh that comes from the belly, unguarded, unperformed. He threw his head back slightly when it happened, and the woman beside him laughed too and touched his arm, and he looked down at her hand on his arm, and he smiled. Not a polite smile, not a professional smile. The other kind. The kind he used to aim at Vivian. The woman was Celeste Rowan. Celeste, who had been Vivian's closest friend since they were 23 years old and met at a gallery opening neither of them wanted to be at. Celeste, who had driven 4 hours at midnight 3 years ago when Vivian called her crying because Adrian had missed their anniversary dinner for the 3rd year in a row. Celeste, who sat on Vivian's kitchen floor at 2 in the morning and held her hands and said, "He's under a lot of pressure, Viv. Men like him carry weight we don't always see. You have to be patient. Patient." Vivian's back was against the marble pillar and she could feel the cold of it through her coat. Her fingers were wrapped around the strap of her handbag, and she was squeezing it so hard her knuckles had gone white, but she didn't notice that yet. She was watching. They were holding hands, not the loose, incidental hand-holding of two people walking side by side. Adrian's thumb was moving in small circles on the back of Celeste's hand, an unconscious gesture, intimate, habitual. The gesture of a man who has held this hand many times before and doesn't have to think about it anymore. They stopped in front of a watch boutique, not Marchetti's, a smaller place, the kind with velvet displays in the window. Celeste pointed at something behind the glass and said something, and Adrian tilted his head and studied the display, and then he looked at her and nodded and put his hand on the small of her back and guided her inside. Vivienne counted her own heartbeats. She got to 7 before she pulled out her phone. She didn't think about what she was doing. Her thumb found his name in her contacts and pressed it, and she lifted the phone to her ear and watched the man across the street through the window of the boutique. She could see him through the glass. He was looking at something in a velvet tray the sales associate was holding out for him. His phone lit up. He glanced at the screen. He saw her name. For one fraction of the second, less than a breath, something moved across his face. She was too far away to name it. Then it was gone, and he pressed the phone to his ear, and he turned slightly away from Celeste, and he answered. "Hey, sweetheart." His voice was warm, easy, practiced. "You okay?" Vivienne said nothing. "I'm stuck in the middle of this thing," he continued, casual, unbothered. "Moretti won't commit to the waterfront numbers, and Bassetti's having one of his moods. It's going to run long. Don't wait up for dinner, all right? I'll pick something up on the way home." She watched him say every word. She watched his mouth form the lie. She watched Celeste drift to the other side of the display case, running her fingertips along a row of watch boxes, giving him space, comfortable enough to give him space, and that detail, that small, domestic, devastating detail, told Vivienne everything she needed to know about how long this had been happening. "Viv?" Adrian said. "You there?" She hung up. She stood behind the marble pillar for another 40 seconds, maybe a minute, long enough to watch him put the phone back in his jacket pocket and return to Celeste's side without a single change in his expression. Long enough to watch him pick up a necklace the associate was holding out and hold it against Celeste's collarbone and tilt his head and say something that made Celeste smile with her whole face. Vivienne recognized the necklace. She had admired it 8 months ago in a magazine, had torn out the page and left it on Adrian's desk with a yellow sticky note that just said, "This is beautiful." The note had been thrown away by the time she checked 2 days later. She'd assumed he hadn't seen it. He had seen it. She walked back to the Bentley. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her hands were flat on her thighs, and she was breathing through her nose, slow and deliberate, because somewhere in the last 5 minutes she had learned something terrible about herself. She did not break the way she had always feared she would. There was no collapse, no howl of grief tearing itself out of her chest. There was something worse than that. There was a strange, spreading stillness, like the surface of a lake in the seconds after a stone has gone under. Everything rippling outward from a center that was already gone. She stayed in the parking structure for 23 minutes. She knew this because she watched the clock on the dashboard the whole time, fixing her eyes on the numbers as though they were the only stable thing in the world. Then she drove home and started making dinner. She made ossobuco because it was his favorite, and it took 3 hours, and the preparation required the kind of focused, mechanical attention that kept her hands busy and her mind just barely on the right side of functional. She browned the veal shanks. She built the sofrito. She added the wine, a Barolo, one of the good ones from the cellar, and she watched it reduce, and she did not think about Celeste's hand on Adrian's arm. She did not think about his thumb making small circles. She did not think about the necklace. She thought about nothing. That was the first skill she'd had to learn in this marriage, and apparently she hadn't forgotten it. Adrian came home at 7:43, carrying a bouquet of pale yellow roses. He kissed her cheek. He smelled like her friend's perfume. Celeste wore Chanel No. 5, always had. It was one of those things Vivienne had always found endearingly predictable about her. And Vivienne breathed it in and set the bouquet in the sink to deal with later and told him dinner was almost ready. "Something smells incredible," he said, loosening his tie. He looked tired in the performative way of men who want credit for the weight they claim to carry. "You didn't have to do all this." "Sit down," she said. Tell me about your day. He sat at the head of the table, which he always did, a habit so ingrained it had stopped being a choice years ago. And he unfolded his napkin and she ladled the ossobuco into a wide bowl the way he liked it and set it in front of him and sat across from him and folded her own hands in her lap. He told her about the Moretti meeting. She listened. He was extraordinarily good at this. She understood that now with a clinical clarity she'd never had before. The details were specific and internally consistent. Moretti's stubbornness about the waterfront contract, Bassetti's outburst, the compromise they'd finally landed on around 6:30. He had the geography of the afternoon mapped out to the degree that a less attentive woman might have believed it without question. He even had a small, self-deprecating story about spilling coffee on his jacket during a tense moment, which explained why he'd changed before coming home. He'd changed before coming home. She hadn't noticed that until right now. "You changed," she said. He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. Just for a beat. Then, "Yeah, I keep a spare suit at the office. Old habit." She nodded. He ate. She moved food around her plate. He asked about her day, and she said she'd stayed home, done some reading, and he nodded without real curiosity and reached for the wine and poured himself a glass and swirled it once the way he always did. And she watched him and thought, "I know every single thing about how you move through a room. I know every one of your habits, and you have used all of them to disappear from me." After dinner, he watched television on the big screen in the living room, and she washed the dishes by hand, which she never did. They had a housekeeper, they had a dishwasher, there was no reason to wash by hand, but she needed to feel the water, needed the heat of it, needed the simple animal fact of her hands doing something real and concrete while the rest of her mind was somewhere else entirely. She heard him laugh at something on the screen, the same laugh she had heard that afternoon through a boutique window 200 feet away. She turned off the faucet and dried her hands on a kitchen towel and stood at the sink for a moment with her eyes closed. The sound of the television drifted through the house. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the city moved in its usual way, indifferent. She had a choice to make. That was the thing about arriving at the truth. She was beginning to understand. The truth itself was not the hard part. The truth was just information, what came after the truth. That was where the real work began. She could walk into that living room and put the information on the table between them. She could say, "I saw you today. I called you and watched you lie to my face from across the street. I know about Celeste." She could do that. She stood at the kitchen sink and held the dish towel and considered it. Not the fantasy version, not the screaming confrontation of a woman scorned, but the real version, the way it would actually go. Adrian was not a man who lost control easily. He'd built an empire on never losing control. If she confronted him, he would deny it. Probably smoothly, probably with just enough detail to create doubt, because that was what he did. He managed situations. She had watched him manage far more dangerous situations than a suspicious wife. And Celeste would have the same story already. She was sure of it. They would have discussed it the way careful people discussed everything. They would have their version already assembled and ready. And if she confronted them and they held their version and she had no proof except her own eyes, then what? What did she have then, except the knowledge that she had shown her hand and lost the only advantage she possessed? She hung the dish towel on the oven door. She thought about this kind of woman she had been at 25, the year she met Adrian Viscari at a charity function, and he had looked at her from across the room with that particular focused attention of his, and she had thought, "He is the most dangerous person in this room." And she had been right. She just hadn't understood yet what kind of dangerous he was. She'd been in love with him for 6 years. She'd been truly, deeply, entirely in love with him. And somewhere in the last 2, without a single dramatic moment, without a fight or a revelation or a day she could point to and say, that was when it happened, he had simply stopped being available. Not physically. He was still there, still sleeping beside her, still eating her food, still kissing her cheek when he came through the door. But whatever she had fallen in love with, that specific quality of attention, the feeling of being seen by someone who saw everything that had gone somewhere else, now she knew where. She went upstairs. She stood in the bathroom for a long time under water that was too hot, and when she finally turned it off, the mirror was completely fogged over, and she stood in front of it and couldn't see herself. And something about that felt appropriate. She put on her nightgown and got into bed on her side and lay in the dark with her eyes open. Adrian came up around 11. She heard him in the bathroom. The ritual of it, the sink running, the drawer opening and closing, the familiar choreography of a man getting ready for sleep. And then the mattress shifted as he settled in beside her. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. He was asleep in 8 minutes. She knew this because she counted. She lay beside him in the dark, and she listened to him breathe. This man she had loved, this man who had lied to her face while she watched, this man who had touched another woman with the same hands that had once cradled her face. And she thought about the watch she had been going to buy for him. It was still at Marchetti's. She'd never made it inside. She thought about the letter she was going to write. The idea came fully formed, the way some things do when a decision has already been made somewhere beneath the level of conscious thought. She was going to write him a letter. She was going to be precise about it, because she was a precise woman. She had always been precise. It was one of the things he'd said he loved about her, once, at the beginning. She was going to say everything she had not said at dinner. She was going to say it once, clearly, and then she was never going to say it again. She lay beside him, and she built the letter in her mind, sentence by careful sentence, and when she finally had it complete, every word exactly where it needed to be, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not grief, not rage, calm. A terrible, bottomless, permanent calm. She turned her head and looked at the outline of his profile in the dark. His chest rose and fell. He was, in the physical sense, exactly the man she had married. Same jaw, same hands, same measured breathing. He looked like someone's idea of a good husband, unconscious and unguarded in the dark. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the ceiling, and for the first time in 5 years of sleepless nights, she knew exactly what she was going to do. She just had to wait until morning. The bedroom was completely silent. Outside, 3 floors below, a car moved through the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling and then gone. Adrian shifted in his sleep, turning slightly toward her, and his hand came to rest on the pillow between them. Not on her, not quite, just near her, the gesture of a man whose body remembered a closeness his waking mind had abandoned. Vivienne watched his hand on the pillow for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She lay perfectly still, her breathing slow and even, and she waited for the first gray light of dawn to begin its move across the window. And she thought about a coastal town she had read about once in a travel magazine. A small place, not on anyone's list, with a street that ran along the water and small shops with salt-weathered signs and mornings that smelled like cold air and the sea. She had thought about that town many times over the years, the way you think about things you've filed away under someday. Someday had arrived. By the time the room began to lighten, Vivienne Hale had already said goodbye to everything in it. She just hadn't moved yet, and the man sleeping 3 feet away from her had no idea. Not the slightest tremor of instinct, not the faintest warning that the world he'd built around her careful, patient, silent love was already over. He just didn't know it yet. She moved before the sun did. That was the first thing. The darkness was still total when Vivienne swung her legs off the side of the bed, her feet finding the cold hardwood floor with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent years learning how not to wake the man sleeping behind her. She sat on the edge of the mattress for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and listened. Adrian's breathing didn't change. Slow, deep, utterly undisturbed. She stood up. She did not look back at him. The walk to the bathroom was 14 steps. She knew this without counting. She'd made this walk 10,000 times in 6 years, navigating by memory, by feel, by the particular geography of a life that had shaped itself around another person without her fully noticing when it happened. She pulled the bathroom door closed behind her, waited until the latch clicked, and then turned on the light above the vanity, which was dimmer than the overhead, and she looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept. She also looked like a woman who had made up her mind about something, and those two things together gave her face a quality she didn't immediately recognize. Stripped down, bare, like a room after the furniture has been moved out, and you can finally see the actual dimensions of the walls. She washed her face, cold water, no ceremony, patted it dry. She went into the walk-in closet. Hers, on the left, which she had always kept immaculately organized in the way of women who need to control at least one small territory in a life that belongs mostly to someone else. And she dressed carefully. Dark slacks, a cream blouse, low boots, the kind of outfit you wear when you need to feel like yourself and can't afford the distraction of being uncomfortable. She did not pack a bag. Not yet. She went downstairs to the study first. Adrian's study, which she technically had equal claim to, but had entered fewer than a dozen times in 4 years because Adrian's study was Adrian's and there were territories in this marriage that had calcified into law through sheer repetition. And she sat at his desk and took a piece of stationery from the middle drawer. Cream paper, heavy stock, his initials embossed at the top in dark blue. She found a pen. His pen. The Mont Blanc he'd been given by someone important at some dinner she hadn't been invited to, and she uncapped it and set it against the paper. She wrote for 11 minutes. She did not draft it first. She did not cross anything out. The words came in the order she had arranged them during the long dark hours of lying beside him, and they went down onto the paper exactly as she had built them in her mind. No more, no less. When she reached the last line, she stopped, read it once from the beginning, and capped the pen. She folded the letter once, set it aside. Then she went to the small safe built into the bookshelf behind his desk. She knew the combination. Of course she did. She'd known it for 5 years. He'd given it to her himself and then apparently forgotten that he had. And she turned the dial and opened it and took out the envelope she needed. Inside were her own documents, passport, birth certificate, the separate bank account she'd maintained in her maiden name throughout their marriage, a habit from her mother that Adrian had always called paranoid, and she had always called practical. The account had not been untouched, exactly. Over the years, she had moved small amounts into it, never enough to be noticeable in the broader landscape of Adrian Vescari's finances, but enough. Enough for exactly this. She closed the safe. She went back to the desk and picked up the letter and walked to the dining room and set it on the table. Then she went back upstairs to the closet and pulled the rolling carry-on from the top shelf. Small, black, the one she used for overnight trips. And she packed it in 8 minutes. Essentials. The things that were actually hers and not artifacts of who she'd become inside this marriage. A few photographs. The bracelet her mother had left her. 3 books she hadn't finished. Clothes enough for a week. Practical choices. Nothing that would make her look like a woman who'd left her husband. Just a woman traveling. She zipped the bag. She stood in the middle of her closet for a moment, looking at the rest of it. 6 years of accumulated wardrobe. The gown she'd worn to the Marchetti Foundation gala 3 years ago. The dress Adrian had bought her for their 2nd anniversary, dark red, still in its garment bag. The shelf of shoes she'd accumulated because when a marriage starts going quiet, some women remodel kitchens, and some women buy shoes, and she had done the latter. She turned off the closet light and walked out. She didn't take the Bentley. She called a car service, a different one than the household account, a company she'd used once on her own 2 years ago and kept the number. And she went downstairs and unlocked the back entrance and wheeled her bag to the service entrance of the building's parking structure and stood in the cold gray light of 5:47 in the morning and waited. The car came in 4 minutes. She got in. She did not look up at the penthouse windows. She told the driver where to go. By 6:15, she was gone. Adrian Vescari woke at 8:12, which was late for him. He'd been sleeping badly for months, a fact he attributed to business pressure, and would never have connected to conscience because he was not particularly practiced at examining his conscience. And he lay in bed for a moment, registering the absence of weight and warmth on the other side of the mattress. That was normal. Vivienne was often up before him. He listened for the sound of the coffee machine or movement in the kitchen below, and heard nothing, and something that wasn't quite alarm but was adjacent to it moved through him briefly before he dismissed it. He showered, dressed, came downstairs. The penthouse was completely quiet, in a way that was different from ordinary morning quiet, though it took him another 3 minutes to identify why. It wasn't just that she wasn't there. It was that there was no evidence of her morning. No coffee made, no windows opened to the cold, no book moved from the side table to the kitchen counter the way she did when she was reading and eating at the same time. The kitchen was exactly as they'd left it after dinner. The flowers he'd brought home were still in the sink. He walked into the dining room. The envelope was on the table. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment before he moved. Later he would remember that moment. The specific quality of the light coming through the east windows, the way the envelope seemed to occupy more space than a piece of paper had any right to. But standing in it, he felt only a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, and then he crossed to the table and picked it up. His name was on the front in her handwriting. Not Adrian, not Honey, or any of the shorthand couples accumulate. Just Vescari. He opened it. He read it standing up, which was how he read everything. He'd never been able to sit while reading anything that required attention, a habit his father had noticed when he was 7 and never mentioned again. He read it once through without stopping. Then he set the paper flat on the table and pressed both hands against the edge and stood there looking at the words. She had been 20 feet away. She'd watched him answer her call. He picked up his phone and called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, her voice professional and neutral in the recording, the voice she used for people she didn't know well, and he said her name once and stopped and ended the call. He called again. Voicemail. He stood in the dining room with his phone in his hand and the letter on the table and the pale yellow roses wilting in the kitchen sink, and he felt something move through his chest that was not unlike the feeling of standing at a window and watching the ground from a very great height. Vertiginous, specific, the sudden understanding of exactly how far there is to fall. He called Marco. Marco Set was his head of security and had been for 11 years. A compact, efficient man from Palermo who communicated in sentences under 8 words and had never, in 11 years, failed to find what Adrian needed found. Marco answered on the first ring. "She's gone," Adrian said. "Find her." A pause. "When?" "Before 6 this morning. Car service, maybe. Check the building cameras, check every car company in the city, check the airports. Done." Marco hung up. Adrian went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed, his side, not hers, and looked at the room. Everything of hers was still there. The photographs on the vanity, the books on her nightstand, the robe on the hook behind the bathroom door. Then he stood and went to the closet and opened her side and looked. The gaps were small and precisely chosen. That was what stopped him. The precision of it. She hadn't taken much. She'd taken exactly enough. The way she'd packed told him something that even the letter hadn't. This was not impulse. She had known before last night. She had lain beside him and known and said nothing and made her calculations and moved. He sat back down on the edge of the bed. His phone buzzed. Marco. No airport. Car service dropped her at the Meridian Hotel on Schaefer. Checked out same morning, cash, different name. After that, nothing. Adrian stared at the floor. Different name. Maiden name, Hale. V. Hale. She'd registered under Hale. She'd planned this. He was still holding the phone when it buzzed again. Different contact. He looked at the screen and felt his jaw tighten. Celeste. He let it ring. She called again 30 seconds later. He silenced it. He was not ready to speak to Celeste. He was not sure he would ever be ready to speak to Celeste again, though he had not yet fully processed why or what exactly he was trying to avoid in that admission. The woman had called him 3 times in the last 10 minutes, which meant she had somehow already heard something, or was trying to reach him about last night, or was simply operating on the assumption that she had full access to his attention at all times, which she did, or had. Something had shifted in the last 40 minutes, and he was still mapping the terrain of it. He went downstairs and poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and drank it and thought. He thought about the watch boutique on 5th, the sales associate laying out options on the velvet tray, Celeste's hand through his arm, the natural ease of it, the complete normalcy of standing in public with her in broad daylight, in a city where half the people on the street knew his face, and the thought that had not occurred to him in the moment, "How have I been this careless?" arrived now with a force that felt almost physical. He set the coffee cup down because his hand wasn't entirely steady. His phone rang again. Not Celeste this time. Carmine Bassetti. He answered because Bassetti was not the kind of man you ignored on a Sunday morning without consequences. "I hear there's a problem," Bassetti said. No greeting. He never greeted people. Domestic. Adrian went still. "Where did you hear that?" "I hear things." Bassetti was 71 years old and had been in this business since before Adrian was born, and his voice always sounded like he was telling you something he'd already decided and was only informing you as a courtesy. "The Hale woman. She's gone. It's handled." "Is it?" Not a question. Because the last thing any of us needs right now, with the Moretti restructure half finished and the Callaway permit still pending, is for your personal situation to become a distraction or a liability. It won't. She knows things, Adrian. She doesn't know anything that matters. A pause on the line, long enough to feel considered. She's been your wife for 6 years. She sat at tables where things were discussed. She's a smart woman. I've always thought she was smarter than you gave her credit for. Don't make the mistake of underestimating her because you undervalued her. Adrian said nothing. Find her, Bassetti said, quietly. Do what needs to be done to contain it. I'm handling it. See that you do. The line went dead. Adrian stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked back to the dining room and picked up the letter and read it a second time. You didn't lose me because you loved someone else. You lost me because you looked me in the eyes through that phone and chose deception over truth. He folded it and put it in his inside jacket pocket. His phone buzzed. Marco again. Nothing at the transit hub. Nothing at the private terminals. I've got men on the coastal routes. She mentioned the coast in a magazine she had at the house. Flagged some places. Could be nothing. Adrian thought about Vivian sitting in their living room with a travel magazine. He thought about the careful, private way she read. Always folding the cover back, never dog-earing pages, sometimes tearing out a single page with a kind of deliberate delicacy that he had always found inexplicably moving and had never told her. He thought about her building an exit strategy out of the pages of a travel magazine over months while he was across town in Celeste's apartment, and the thought landed somewhere behind his sternum with a weight he wasn't prepared for. Keep looking, he said. He went to his study. He sat in his chair, the same chair where she'd written the letter, though he didn't know that. And he opened his laptop and he started making calls. He had resources beyond Marco, beyond all of them. He had the kind of reach that could find a ghost if the ghost had a social security number and had ever used a credit card or stood in front of a security camera. He started pulling those threads one by one, working with the focused, methodical efficiency that had built his empire from a single bad decision made in a waterfront warehouse 20 years ago. He worked for 3 hours straight. He found nothing. She had disappeared as cleanly as if the city had simply absorbed her. It was almost 2 in the afternoon when Celeste showed up. He heard the elevator. She had the code, had for 2 years, another piece of carelessness he was now accounting for. And then her heels on the marble of the entry, and then she was in the doorway of his study. She was dressed for Sunday, which meant she was dressed beautifully, which was always true. She was a woman who knew exactly how she looked and used it with the precision of a professional tool, which was one of the things that had drawn him initially, and now, standing in his doorway uninvited on the worst morning of his adult life, read differently. You haven't answered any of my calls, she said. I know. She came into the study, sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair clients sat in, adversaries sat in, the chair he positioned at a specific distance from his desk to establish a particular power dynamic, without appearing to register any of that. What happened? I've been hearing things from the Bassetti side all morning, people saying, Vivian, stop. His voice came out flat, not loud, flat. She stopped. He looked at her from across the desk and he thought about the boutique on 5th, and he thought about Vivian standing somewhere he hadn't known, somewhere with a marble pillar and a clear sight line, watching everything. He thought about how long that specific moment had been building, all the accumulated carelessness, all the public lunches and the hand-holding on open streets, and the way he'd let 2 years of this become ordinary enough that he'd stop checking his surroundings the way a man in his position always had to check his surroundings. She saw us yesterday, he said. Celeste's face went through several things very quickly. Surprise. Then calculation. Then something that wanted to look like concern, but didn't quite land. What do you mean she saw us? On 5th, she was there. She said something. She called you. And then she stopped, because she remembered or she worked it out. He could see her doing it. The phone call. The brief pause in their conversation when he'd stepped away to answer. She'd been close enough to hear him tell Vivian he was in a board meeting. Oh, she said. Yeah. Silence. Celeste leaned back slightly in the chair. Her fingers came up and touched the necklace at her collarbone, the necklace he'd bought her yesterday, which she was wearing today, which she apparently hadn't thought twice about, and Adrian looked at it and felt a cold, specific revulsion that surprised him with its intensity. Where did she go? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? You have Marco. You have... I don't know, he said again, and something in how he said it made her go quiet. She looked at him for a moment. Then, Adrian, she's your wife, and she's left, and you have resources that could find her in 6 hours. Why are you sitting here? Because I read her letter. Celeste said nothing. Because she was 20 feet away and she watched me lie directly into the phone, and then she went home and made dinner and asked me about my day and listened to every word and said nothing. He stopped. His jaw was tight. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She came home and cooked dinner. She sat across from me and asked me to explain my day. And I did. He could hear what his own voice sounded like, and he couldn't stop it. I sat there and lied to her face for 45 minutes over food she'd made for 3 hours, and she already knew every word was a lie, and she never said a single thing. Celeste was very still. She didn't fight, he said. She didn't yell. She didn't throw anything, or call me names, or demand to know how long. She just listened, and then she got up and washed the dishes. Adrian. She went to sleep. You need to find her, Celeste said, and her voice had changed into something firmer, more practical, the voice she used when she was trying to manage a situation. Whatever you're feeling right now, the reality is that she's out there alone. She knows things about the business that could... Don't. His voice cut across the room like something physical. Don't make this about the business. Celeste met his eyes. Everything is about the business. You know that. That's the life. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back, and he could see her working out the shape of what she was seeing in his face, and he watched the moment she identified it, because something in her expression shifted, just slightly, just a degree or two, from management mode into something more careful. What are you thinking? She said. I'm thinking you should go, he said. She didn't move. Adrian, I'm not angry. And it was the truth, which was the strangest part. He wasn't. He was something he didn't have a clean word for. Hollowed, maybe. Precise. Like a man who has just understood the exact dimensions of what he's broken and is still standing in the rubble counting. I'm not angry at you, but you need to leave. We need to talk about... There's nothing to talk about. He said it quietly. Go home, Celeste. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She picked up her bag from the arm of the chair with the composed, deliberate movements of a woman who refused to let a room see her wounded, which he recognized because Vivian had the same quality, though she'd learned it for different reasons, and that parallel landed in him like something sharp. At the doorway she stopped. You're going to spend the rest of your life looking for her, Celeste said. Not cruelly, almost gently. And she's not going to want to be found. He didn't answer. She left. The elevator closed. The penthouse was silent. He sat in the chair in the study with the letter in his jacket pocket and his empire running itself in the background, calls going unreturned, messages accumulating on 3 different phones, the machinery of 20 years grinding along without him because it was too large to need him for every turn of every gear. He thought about a woman who had cooked his favorite dinner while she was already gone inside. He thought about her hands in the dishwater. He picked up his phone and called Marco. Pull everything, he said. Airports, trains, bus terminals, every coastal town within 400 miles. Find a woman named Vivian Hale. No noise. Don't touch her. Just find her. And when we do? Adrian looked at the empty doorway where Celeste had stood. Just find her first, he said. We'll figure out the rest. He put the phone down. He opened the letter again, the 3rd time now. And he read the last line. The one that had been sitting in the back of his skull since 8 in the morning, like a splinter working its way toward something vital. The woman who waited for you every night died yesterday. He sat with that for a long time in the silence of everything she'd left behind, while 3 floors below, the city moved through its ordinary Sunday afternoon entirely unbothered, and somewhere beyond the reach of every resource he possessed, Vivian Hale was already becoming someone he no longer had the right to. He had not slept in 31 hours when the first real crack appeared. It didn't come from where he expected. It never did, in his experience. The thing that breaks you is never the thing you've been watching. You spend all your attention on the obvious threat, the one you can name and measure and position men against, and then something sideways and quiet walks straight through the door you forgot to lock. The call came at 6:43 Monday morning. Not Marco. Not Bassetti. His lawyer, Renata Foss, a woman who had been protecting the legal architecture of the Vescari operation for 14 years, and who communicated with the same brisk antiseptic precision of a surgeon who has decided emotion is a liability and excised it accordingly. When Renata called before 7 in the morning, it was never good news. "We have a problem," she said, "and I need you to not speak until I finish." Adrian was at his desk. He hadn't moved from the study in hours, the accumulated debris of a sleepless night arranged around him. 3 coffee cups, 2 phones, a legal pad covered in his own handwriting, a half-eaten piece of toast that had gone cold and stiff on the corner of the desk. He'd been running searches, cross-referencing Marco's dead ends with his own contacts, building a map of everywhere Vivian wasn't, working inward toward wherever she actually was by process of elimination. The way you solve certain kinds of problems when the direct approach keeps failing. "Go," he said. Vivian filed a legal separation notice Saturday morning, Renata said, before she left. She used an attorney in the Callaway district, Piers Hartman, family law, good reputation, aggressive. The notice was time-stamped 6:04 a.m. She filed it digitally the moment offices opened. Adrian sat very still. She filed before she left the building. By 9 minutes. He thought about the car service at 5:47. She'd been moving for an hour before the filing went through. She had timed it, had the filing ready, had it scheduled, had built a sequence that meant by the time he was reading her letter over his morning coffee, she was already a legal document in a courthouse database. "There's more," Renata said. He waited. Hartman attached a petition for asset disclosure as part of the separation filing. It's standard procedurally, but the scope of what he's requesting is not standard. He's asking for full financial disclosure going back 8 years. All holdings, all accounts, all business entities in which your name appears directly or indirectly. A pause. "Adrian, he's not fishing. The petition is specific. He names the Callaway Waterfront LLC by its actual registered number. He names the Meridian Holdings shell. He names 4 accounts in the Cayman structure by their routing identifiers. The silence on Adrian's end lasted exactly 4 seconds. "She didn't know those numbers," he said. "She knew them," Renata said, "or someone gave them to her." The study was very quiet. Outside, the city had started its Monday morning machinery. He could hear traffic 40 floors below, faint as a rumor. He could hear his own breathing. "Hartman filed this as a civil matter," Renata continued, "which means it stays out of criminal jurisdiction unless something in the disclosure triggers a separate inquiry. But the moment financial regulators see this petition, and they will see it because Hartman is smart enough to know who to CC and when, the Callaway restructure freezes. Everything attached to it freezes. We're talking about a $200 million standstill, minimum. How long do we have? Before the freeze? 48 hours. Maybe less if Hartman moves to expedite, which, based on how precise this filing is, I'd assume he will." Adrian stood up from the desk. He walked to the window, the east-facing one, which gave him the city in its Monday morning state, all glass and steel and ordinary indifferent motion, and he pressed one hand flat against the cool surface and looked out at it. "She did this before she left," he said, not to Renata specifically, just saying it, establishing it. "Yes. She built a legal structure around herself before she walked out the door. Hartman is very good. This didn't happen over a weekend. This took weeks of preparation, minimum. More likely months." Months. He stood at the window and thought about Vivian moving through the last several months of their shared life, sitting at the dinner table, sleeping in their bed, asking him about his day, laughing at the appropriate moments, while somewhere beneath all of it, she was building an exit strategy precise enough to lock $200 million in regulatory limbo within 9 minutes of filing. He thought about Bassetti calling her smarter than he'd given her credit for. He took the phone from his ear and held it against his chest for a moment, and breathed through his nose and looked at the city and thought, "You underestimated her for 6 years. You watched her read her books and arrange her flowers and make your dinner, and you looked at all that quiet and you read it as stillness. You never once considered that it might be depth." He brought the phone back up. "Can Hartman be pressured?" Renata's response came with about half a second of loaded silence. He's not that kind of attorney. Everyone is that kind. Not Hartman. I've dealt with him twice. No, not that way. And attempting it would make things significantly worse, which I should not need to explain to you. He understood what she was not saying. Hartman had likely anticipated exactly this call, had probably built protections into the filing specifically because he'd done his homework on Adrian Viscari and understood what kinds of responses were in his toolkit. The man had taken a client who was disappearing into the wind and made her legally untouchable before she even got to the car. She had chosen well. "What's our best move?" he asked. "Cooperate with the disclosure process. Get ahead of it. Come in clean." He said nothing. "Adrian, I know that's not a sentence you've ever enjoyed hearing, but the alternative is that the civil petition generates enough regulatory interest to invite a conversation you genuinely don't want. Vivian isn't trying to burn you down. The scope of the filing is defensive, not prosecutorial. She wants out clean. She wants what's hers. If you let this turn adversarial, Hartman will make it adversarial in ways that won't be contained to the civil court." He leaned his forehead against the glass. Cold. Very cold. He stayed like that for a moment. "Set up a meeting," he said. "You, me, and whoever we need in the room. Today." "I'll call you in an hour." Renata hung up. He stood at the window for another full minute before he straightened up and turned back to the room. The study looked different to him now. Had been looking different since yesterday, if he was honest. The accumulated evidence of his careful, controlled, constructed life revealing itself to be something other than what he'd believed it to be. The books on the shelves were his, the desk was his, the view was his, all of it purchased and arranged and maintained by the machinery of a man who had spent 20 years building a world that felt like proof of something. He had forgotten what it was supposed to be proof of. His phone buzzed. Marco. He answered it, walking back toward the desk. "I found something," Marco said. "Not her, but something. Talk. The car service she used Saturday, Schaefer and 11th. Driver's name is Petrov. Alexei Petrov. Works freelance, private clients. I put pressure on him this morning." A pause. "He's done this before." Adrian stopped walking. "What does that mean?" "Vivian has used him 4 times in the last 3 months. Always early morning, always cash. 3 of those times he dropped her at the Hartman offices on Callaway." 3 months. She'd been going to the attorney for 3 months. "The 4th time?" Adrian said. 2 weeks ago. He dropped her at a neighborhood on the east side, Fenwick District. She was gone about 90 minutes and came back with a bag from an office supply store. He sat down on the edge of the desk. "She was building a case," he said. "Looks like." "Was she alone?" "All 4 times." "3 times." "The second visit..." Marco stopped. "Say it." "The second visit, she wasn't alone. A woman came out of the building with her. They talked on the sidewalk for about 10 minutes. Description. Petrov says mid-40s, dark coat, short hair. He didn't get a name." Another pause. "But he remembered her, said she had a scar on her left hand, back of it, L-shaped, distinctive." The room tilted very slightly. Adrian knew that scar. He knew exactly how Renata Foss had gotten it. A broken glass at a firm Christmas party 11 years ago, 2 weeks after she'd started working for him. A story she'd told once and never repeated. L-shaped, back of the left hand. He sat on the edge of his own desk, and he felt something move through him that he had not felt since he was 23 years old, and realizing for the first time that someone in his organization had turned against him. It was a specific feeling, like the ground demonstrating, in a very small but very complete way, that it was not obligated to remain solid. "That's all," he said to Marco. "Don't do anything." He ended the call. He sat there, and he built it out. Renata had been his attorney for 14 years. Had full access to the entity structures, the account numbers, the shell formations, all of it. Had helped construct the Callaway LLC, had the Meridian Holdings documentation in her own files. Had every number that Hartman's petition named with specific precision, because she had built those structures herself. Vivian had gone to Renata. Or Renata had gone to Vivian. Or, and this was the version that sat coldest in his chest, Renata had been in contact with Vivian for 3 months, guiding her, arming her, building the legal architecture of her exit with the same hands that had built the financial architecture of his empire. He thought about the call this morning. Renata's voice, precise and measured, laying out the situation, recommending cooperation, clean and simple. Cooperate with the disclosure. Get ahead of it. Come in clean. Of course, cooperate with the disclosure. The disclosure had been designed by his own attorney. It would be surgically calibrated to be exactly as damaging as it needed to be to make him cooperate, and not a degree more, because Renata was precise, and precision meant the threat was most effective when it was credible but contained. You didn't burn the building down if what you needed was to make the owner move. He picked up his phone and called her back. She answered on the third ring. "You went to her," he said. A beat of silence, very brief. If he hadn't been listening for it, he might have missed it. "Adrian? Or she came to you, either way. You've been working with Vivian for 3 months." The silence this time was longer, more considered. He had the distinct sensation of watching a very intelligent person decide in real time which version of the truth was still salvageable. "I couldn't," she started. "Don't." His voice was very quiet and very flat, which was how his voice got when something inside him went past a certain temperature. Not louder, colder, the way extreme cold at a certain point becomes indistinguishable from burning. "Don't explain it to me like I'm someone you need to manage. Tell me what happened." Another silence. Then, with something that might have been exhaustion, "She came to me 4 months ago. She suspected something. She was already suspicious before last Saturday, Adrian. Whatever you think she saw by accident, she'd been tracking it for months. She came to me because I was the only person in your world she thought she could trust. And you helped her." "Yes." He stood up from the edge of the desk. He walked to the window again because it was the only direction his body seemed to want to move. Back to the window, back to the view of the ordinary city going about its ordinary Monday. 14 years, he said. "I know. I gave you 14 years. You did." And now her voice had something in it he hadn't expected. Not defiance exactly, but not apology either. Steadiness. The kind that comes from having made a decision and lived with it long enough to stop second-guessing it. "And she gave you 6. She was a better person than the situation she was in. I've watched you in 14 years run through 12 people I thought were irreplaceable. I watched what happened to all of them. I watched what was happening to her." A pause. "She didn't deserve it. See, nam modicie, and I did. That's not what I said. That's what you meant." She didn't answer that. He stood at the window and breathed and looked at the city and thought about 14 years of Renata Foss building the legal walls of his empire, while apparently deciding, at some point in the last 4 months, that the woman he'd been systematically failing deserved a wall of her own. "The petition," he said. "Is it real or is it leverage?" "It's real." No hesitation. "The account numbers, the entity structures, it's all accurate and it's all on file. If you don't respond cooperatively to the disclosure request, Hartman has standing to escalate. He will escalate. He is not bluffing. And if I cooperate, Vivian gets what she's entitled to from the legitimate assets. You restructure the rest quietly. No one lights anything on fire. And you," a pause. "I'm resigning as your counsel, effective today. I'll provide a full handoff to whoever you designate. Everything will be proper and orderly." He almost laughed. It came up in his chest, something between a laugh and something else entirely, and he stopped it before it reached his throat. "Proper and orderly," he said. "Right. Adrian, don't." He took 1 breath. 2. "Don't say anything else. Just send me the documentation. All of it. Whatever you have on the petition." He paused. "And Renata?" "Yes." "Is she all right?" The silence this time felt different from all the others. Softer, in a way he hadn't expected from a Monday morning conversation about betrayal and legal exposure. "She's fine," Renata said, and then quietly, "She's better than fine, actually." He nodded even though she couldn't see it. "Send the documents," he said, and hung up. He stood at the window for a long time after. The city below was absolutely indifferent to everything, the traffic patterns and pedestrian rhythms running their usual Monday logic. None of it knowing or caring that 40 floors up, a man who had spent 20 years constructing a world that felt permanent was standing at the window of it, understanding, with a specificity that was almost physical, Exactly how temporary everything he'd built actually was. Not the money, not the exposure, not even the empire. He meant the specific construction of himself he had built and lived inside for 20 years. The version of Adrian Vescari who controlled rooms, who solved problems with money or force or the implicit threat of either, who had moved through the world as though it were a landscape that existed to accommodate him. That version was standing at a window right now, discovering that the two people who'd had the most access to the machinery of his life had, independently or together, decided he was wrong about something fundamental. And the worst part, the part that had been sitting in the back of his skull since he'd read Vivian's letter for the first time yesterday morning and hadn't stopped sitting there, was that he couldn't construct a coherent argument that they were mistaken. His phone rang. Bassetti. He let it ring. It rang again. He answered it. "I've been hearing things," Bassetti said, and his voice had changed from yesterday's measured concern into something older and harder and much less patient. "Things about legal filings, things about financial disclosure, things about your personal situation becoming a structural problem for people who are not your personal situation. I know about the filing." "Then you know it needs to disappear." Not a suggestion, not even a request. The flat declarative of a man who has given orders for 50 years and has not yet encountered a situation that required him to frame them differently. "I can't make it disappear," Adrian said. A pause. "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. It's been filed, Carmine. It's in the system. If I try to suppress it, that generates more attention than cooperating with it. My attorney—" He stopped, corrected himself. "My former attorney has already indicated the scope. I'm going to comply with the disclosure on the legitimate assets and restructure the rest." "Restructure." Bassetti said the word like he was checking its weight. "You want to restructure. Now. In the middle of the Callaway deal. The Callaway deal is already frozen pending the disclosure review. Moving on it now would— I don't care what it would do." And now the old man's voice had dropped into something very quiet and very hard. The register that Adrian had heard him use exactly 3 times in 20 years and had never been the target of until this moment. "I care that you have allowed a domestic problem, a woman, to reach into the operational structure of this organization and pull threads that do not belong to her. That is not a legal problem, Adrian. That is a competence problem. And a competence problem of this magnitude has consequences that don't get resolved in a courthouse." Adrian stood very still. "Come see me," Bassetti said. "Tonight. My house. 7 o'clock. The line went dead. He lowered the phone. He stood at the window of the penthouse in the Monday morning light, and he understood, with complete and absolute clarity, exactly what had just happened. Bassetti's patience had a perimeter, and Adrian had just walked past it. Tonight at 7 meant a conversation that would not be about legal strategy or financial restructuring. It would be about whether Adrian Vescari was still the kind of man the organization could afford to have at its center, or whether the spectacular, visible, ongoing failure of his personal life had revealed something about his judgment that made him a liability rather than an asset. He thought about Vivian in her coastal town. He thought about Renata resigning. He thought about Celeste's voice in the doorway. "You're going to spend the rest of your life looking for her." He looked at his own reflection in the glass of the window, ghost pale, superimposed against the city, transparent in the Monday light. And he thought about the 20-year construction of himself and all the things he had broken and discarded along the way to building it. And he thought about a woman who had cooked his favorite dinner on the worst night of her life, and washed the dishes by hand and gone upstairs and lain beside him and said not one single word. And he thought that perhaps the most honest thing that had happened to him in 20 years was a letter he had not deserved and could not answer, and was never going to stop reading for the rest of his life. He put his phone in his pocket. He went upstairs. He went to her closet, the left side, her side, exactly as she'd left it, and he stood in the doorway of it for a long moment, looking at what remained. The dark red dress and its garment bag, the row of shoes, the careful, precise organization of a woman who had needed to control at least one small corner of a world that had never really been hers to shape. He reached out and touched the edge of one sleeve, something simple, a cream blouse, the kind she wore when she wanted to feel like herself, and the fabric was completely ordinary between his fingers, just cotton and a little silk, nothing that should have any particular weight to it. It had all the weight in the world. He closed the closet door. He went back downstairs and sat at the desk and picked up his phone and called the one person he had not yet called, the one call he'd been not making since Sunday morning, the one he'd been circling around the edges of without being able to commit to the center of it. The number rang 3 times. Vivian did not answer. He had not expected her to. But he sat there with the ringing in his ear and the city below going about its ordinary business, and Bassetti's dinner invitation sitting in his chest like something with edges. And he understood, completely, finally, with the specific finality of a door closing in a room you will not be allowed back into, that the next 12 hours were going to require him to become a different kind of man than the one he had spent 20 years building, or the one he'd been building was going to take everything else down with it when it finally fell. He ended the call. He sat in the silence of everything she'd left behind. And for the first time in 20 years, Adrian Viscari did not know what to do next, and there was no one left in the room to tell him. He spent the afternoon doing something he had not done in 20 years. He sat still, not the stillness of a man waiting for information or calculating his next move. The other kind. The kind that happens when the machinery of your life has been running so long at such volume that when it finally stops, the silence is almost unbearable, and you sit inside it anyway because there is nothing left to do but feel the full weight of what you've built and what you've broken and what the difference between those two things actually cost. The penthouse was quiet in every room. He thought about Bassetti's dinner at 7, and he thought about Vivian, and he thought about Renata. And somewhere around 4 in the afternoon, a thought arrived that had been working its way toward him since Monday morning and finally landed with the specific force of something that has traveled a long distance to find you. He had spent 31 hours trying to locate Vivian. He had spent those same hours treating her disappearance as a problem to be solved, a variable to be controlled, a situation to be managed back into a shape he recognized. He had pointed every resource he possessed at the problem of finding her. He had not once asked himself why he wanted to find her, not what he would do when he did, not what he would say, not what he actually wanted the outcome to look like. He had just deployed force in the direction of the problem the way he always deployed force, because that was the only language he was truly fluent in, and somewhere in the last 6 years he had started speaking it to Vivian too. Not with violence, never that, but with the particular violence of a man who treats every difficulty in his life as something to be conquered rather than understood. He had conquered her right out of his life. He picked up the letter from the desk. He read it for the 4th time. When he finished, he put it face down on the desk and pressed his palm flat against the back of it and sat with his hand on the paper for a long time, feeling his own pulse against the paper, feeling the weight of his hand against the words he hadn't earned. At 6:15, he got up, put on his jacket, and went to meet Bassetti. The old man's house was in the Alderton district, a neighborhood that had been respectable once, had declined, and had then been rebuilt by the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew it was there. Bassetti's property sat behind a stone wall on a double lot, the house itself deliberately understated from the outside, the kind of building that looked from the street like the home of a very wealthy dentist until you got inside and understood what kind of wealth actually lived there. Marco drove. He didn't speak. Adrian sat in the back seat and watched the city go past and thought about the particular quality of a meeting that begins with the host choosing the location, the time, and the terms, which was every meeting with Bassetti, which was why Bassetti had held his position for 41 years while everyone around him had eventually been replaced or removed or simply stopped existing. The car pulled up at 6:58. 2 of Bassetti's men were at the gate. They didn't search Adrian. That would have been an insult, and Bassetti ran to a specific code about insults. But they walked him inside in a way that made it clear the walking wasn't optional. Through the front hall, past the sitting room where Bassetti held the meetings he wanted witnesses to, past the library, all the way to the back of the house where a smaller room looked out onto a garden that was still brown with late season, bare trees and dormant flower beds, and a stone path running through all of it toward a wall at the back. Bassetti was standing at the window when Adrian came in. He was 71 years old, and he looked like a man who had been 71 for 20 years, and would still be 71 when everyone else in the room was dead. Compact, contained, the kind of stillness that isn't calm, but is the thing that lives just on the other side of it. He was holding a glass of something amber, but he hadn't drunk from it. He heard Adrian come in, and he didn't turn around immediately, which was also deliberate, which was always deliberate with Bassetti. Then he turned. Sit down, he said. Adrian sat. The chair was positioned in the center of the room, away from the walls, away from anything you could put your back to. Also deliberate. Bassetti looked at him for a moment. Then he went and sat in the chair across from him, which was positioned slightly higher, the floor under it raised by perhaps an inch on a subtle platform. An old trick. The kind of thing you noticed and weren't supposed to mention. Tell me what happened, Bassetti said. You know what happened. I want to hear it from you. Adrian looked at the old man and thought about the 17 different things he could say in this room and the relative cost of each of them, the way he always thought about conversations with Bassetti, mapping the terrain before he moved. Then he thought about Vivian sitting across from him at the dinner table on Saturday night, mapping the same terrain, making the same calculations, and choosing to say nothing. He thought about how that had turned out. I was careless, he said, publicly careless, for long enough that she saw it. She documented it. She built a legal case around herself using access to the financial structure that I gave her attorney, who turned out to be working with her for the last 4 months. The legal exposure is real but contained. It doesn't touch the core operational structure. Bassetti nodded slowly. The Callaway freeze. Temporary. Renata built the petition to be surgical, not terminal. She wants a settlement, not a war. Renata. Bassetti said the name with a specific flatness. Your attorney of 14 years built a weapon out of your own financial architecture and handed it to your wife. Yes. And you didn't see either of these things coming. Adrian said nothing. The wife, Bassetti said. The attorney. He set his glass down on the side table, very gently, the gesture of a man who has decided he doesn't need it anymore. 2 women, both inside your walls, both moving against you simultaneously for months, and you were... He paused, selecting the word with care, occupied. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a car moved on the street beyond the garden wall. I've known you for 20 years, Bassetti said. I watched you build from nothing. I watched you make decisions under pressure that men twice your age couldn't make. I trusted you with parts of this organization that I've never trusted to anyone else. Not because you were perfect, because you were precise. He stopped. What happened to the precision, Adrian? Adrian looked at the garden through the window, brown and dormant and patient, waiting for a season that hadn't arrived yet. I got comfortable, he said. Men who get comfortable in this life get dead, Bassetti said. Or they get exposed. You got the second one, which means you still have the option to fix it, which is the only reason we're having a conversation instead of something else entirely. He let that sit. The question I need answered tonight is simple. Can you fix it? The legal exposure, the operational freeze, the signal that this sends to everyone watching. Can you fix it, and can you do it without creating more damage than it resolves? Yes. Tell me how. Adrian had thought about this in the car, had thought about it actually since 4 in the afternoon when he'd been sitting in the stillness of the penthouse, and the answer had arrived in a form he hadn't expected. Not as a strategy, but as something simpler and less comfortable than strategy. I cooperate with the disclosure on the legitimate assets, he said. Full compliance, clean paperwork, nothing that gives the regulators a reason to look harder. The settlement with Vivian is generous, fair, and fast. Fast matters. A long contested settlement generates visibility. A fast, clean one reads as a private domestic matter that resolves itself. The Callaway freeze lifts once the disclosure is satisfied. We're operational again in 10 days, 2 weeks at most. Bassetti was listening with his hands folded in his lap, watching Adrian's face with the patient attention of a man who has sat through a great many explanations and is waiting for the specific place where this one will break. And the other assets, Bassetti said, the ones the petition names that aren't in the legitimate category. Get restructured, now. Not in response to the petition. That happens in parallel, separately, through channels that aren't connected to the legal filing. By the time anyone looks at them directly, they look different. That's a 60-day operation minimum. 50 if we start tonight. Bassetti was quiet for a moment. His eyes hadn't left Adrian's face. And the attorney. Gone. Already done. Clean handoff. Nothing punitive. Punitive creates grievance, and grievance creates motivation to talk. She leaves whole, and she stays quiet, because staying quiet was part of the arrangement she built with Vivian. She doesn't want to burn me, Carmine. She wanted to get Vivian out. Those are different objectives. The old man sat with this for a long moment. The clock on the mantel moved. Outside, something in the garden moved. Wind in the bare branches, a dry sound. And the woman, Bassetti said finally. Adrian looked at him. Vivian, Bassetti said, she's out there with what she knows. The settlement pays her and she goes away. You're confident she stays away? Adrian held the old man's gaze and he said, yes, and the word cost him something he didn't have a name for and didn't try to identify. Bassetti looked at him for 4 full seconds. Then he nodded once, the small definitive nod of a man who has decided something and will not revisit it. You have 2 weeks, he said. The Callaway deal runs on schedule or it doesn't run at all. And if it doesn't run at all, this conversation gets reopened under different terms. You understand me? I understand. Good. Bassetti stood. The meeting was over. Fix your house, Adrian. Then fix mine. Adrian drove back with Marco silent at the wheel and the city going past in its nighttime form, and somewhere around the 3rd mile, he said, without planning to say it, I'm going to sign the settlement agreement. Marco said nothing. Everything Hartman asked for, the full value. I'm going to sign it tomorrow morning and have it filed before noon. Marco's eyes moved to the mirror for a fraction of a second, then back to the road. You don't want to negotiate? No. The city moved past. She earned it, Adrian said. Then he stopped talking. He got back to the penthouse at 9:40. He went upstairs. He stood outside the door of her closet for a moment, then didn't open it, went back downstairs, sat at the desk. He called the number for his new counsel, a man named Strickland he'd retained twice for specific matters and found appropriately unsentimental about everything except accuracy, and left a message outlining what he needed in the morning. Then he sat in the study and he looked at the walls of books and the desk and the city through the window, and he thought about 2 weeks and 50 days and the machinery of containment and damage control, and underneath all of that, in the place where those calculations didn't quite reach, he thought about autumn light on a coastal street and a woman who had stopped checking her phone for someone who never came. His phone lit up at 10:43, unknown number, but the area code was one he'd seen Marco flag on the search, coastal region, 400 miles northeast. He picked it up before the second ring, silence on the other end, just breath, alive and present. He said her name, nothing for a long moment. Then, don't look for me. Her voice was quiet, not cold, just finished. The voice of a woman who has said everything she needed to say and is only making this call because there is one logistical thing that needs to exist between them before the door closes completely. Sign the papers. Whatever Hartman sent you, sign them. I don't want to fight. I never wanted to fight. I know. His throat was not entirely cooperating. He pushed through it. Viv, don't. Not hard, just clear. Whatever you're going to say, don't. He stopped. I didn't call because I want to hear it, she said. I called because I need to know you're going to sign it, and I'm going to hear your voice say it one time, and then that's all. I'm signing it tomorrow morning, he said. Full terms. Everything Hartman asked for. A pause. He heard her exhale. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter than relief. Something that sounded like the specific release of a tension you've been holding so long, your body had stopped registering it as tension. Okay, she said. Vivian? He said it anyway. He couldn't not. I know you don't want to hear it, but I need you to know that I understand what I... Adrian. Her voice was gentle in a way that was worse than if it had been hard. I know you do. I think you actually do, which is... It doesn't change anything, but I know you do. A pause. I hope you figure out what it is you were looking for. I really do. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and breathed through his nose and looked at the window, at the city, at his own ghost reflection in the glass. Are you safe? He said. Are you? I'm good. And something in how she said it, just those 2 words, the specific weight of them, the absence of performance, made them the truest thing he'd heard in years. I'm actually good. Okay, he said. She hung up. He sat in the silent study for a long time with the phone in his hand and the city outside doing its indifferent thing, All that ordinary nighttime motion that had nothing to do with him, and the clock on the desk moved from 10:47 to 10:48 to 10:49, and somewhere out there, 400 miles up the coast, a woman with a carry-on bag and a separate bank account, and a lawyer who had fought for her and a life she was building out of the pieces she'd chosen for herself was probably standing at a window too, looking at whatever water there was to look at, breathing the cold salt air in, breathing the past out. At 10:50, he picked up his phone and called Strickland. Strickland answered on the second ring, which was what you paid Strickland for. "I need the settlement documents ready to execute by 8 a.m., Adrian said. "Full terms. Nothing negotiated, nothing amended. I'm signing exactly what Hartman filed." A brief pause. "That's a significant concession." "I know what it is." His voice was steady. "Have it ready." "Done." Strickland hung up. Adrian set the phone on the desk. He thought he might be able to sleep now. He wasn't sure. His body felt like a building after an interior wall has been removed. Structurally the same, technically intact, but aware of a new space in the center of itself that would take some time to learn how to move around. He went upstairs. He passed her closet without stopping. He got into bed, his side, and lay in the dark. He thought about Bassetti's garden, brown and dormant and patient. He thought about 50 days of operational restructuring and the Callaway deal running on its revised schedule, and the machinery of his life finding its new shape around the space where the two most important women in it used to be. He thought about all of that, and underneath it, like a current beneath a surface that looks still, he thought about what he was going to do with a life that had been stripped back to what it actually contained. Not what he'd built, not what he'd acquired, what he'd done, who he'd become. What 20 years of decisions made by a man who told himself that the end justified the means had actually added up to, counted one by one, held in daylight. He lay in the dark and he faced that inventory, and he did not look away from it. And sometime after midnight, with the city quiet below and the penthouse quiet around him and the letter still on the desk in the study 3 floors down, Adrian Vescari fell into the first real sleep he'd had in days. Not restful, not peaceful, but genuine. The sleep of a man who has stopped running and finally turned around to see what's been behind him all along. He would need the sleep, because when he woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of his phone and Marco's voice on the other end saying 2 words, Bassetti's men, in a tone he had not heard Marco use in 11 years, Adrian understood immediately that signing the settlement in the morning was going to be the smallest problem he faced today, because Bassetti had lied. The meeting was not over, and somewhere in the long quiet hours between 10 o'clock and 5 in the morning, while Adrian was lying in his bed making peace with his failures, someone had decided that 2 weeks was more patience than the situation. The phone was still warm in his hand when the second call came in. Not Marco this time. One of the outer perimeter men, Dove, a quiet Hungarian who had worked the building's security rotation for 6 years and had never called Adrian directly, not once, because that was not how the chain of command operated, and Dove understood chains of command the way some men understood music, instinctively and completely. The fact that Dove was calling Adrian's personal number at 5:07 in the morning meant the chain of command had already broken somewhere above him. 3 vehicles, Dove said. His voice was controlled, but Adrian could hear the particular quality of breathing that happened when a trained man was working to stay calm against something his body had already assessed as dangerous. Underground. They came through the service entrance on the Callaway side. They have credentials, building management credentials, proper ones. Marco's not answering. Adrian was already out of bed, feet on the floor. How long ago? 4 minutes? Maybe 5. Stay on the door. Don't engage. Where's Torres? Torres is... I can't raise Torres. Adrian moved to the closet. Not hers. His. He pulled on clothes with the fast mechanical efficiency of a man whose body has remembered something his comfortable years had almost covered over. The muscle memory of urgency, of moving before thought catches up. He reached behind the false panel at the back of the shelf, and his hand found what it was looking for, and he pulled it out and checked it without looking, by feel, the way you do when you've done it enough times. Listen to me carefully, he said to Dove. Do not be on that floor when they come off the elevator. Do you understand me? Get to the stairwell on the east side and get out of the building. Sir, that's not a request. He ended the call. He stood in the center of the bedroom for 3 seconds, which was all the time available for thinking, and he thought. Bassetti had moved fast, faster than the 2-week timeline he'd offered at dinner, which meant the dinner had been a diagnostic, not a negotiation. Bassetti had sat across from him and listened and assessed and decided, somewhere between the garden window and the amber glass he never drank from, that Adrian Vescari had become a structural problem that the organization could not afford to carry through a 50-day restructure and a legal settlement process and whatever else came next. Cutting it now was cleaner. Cutting it tonight, before the settlement was signed and the documents were in the system and there was a legal paper trail that someone might eventually want to follow backward, was the kind of precision Bassetti had practiced for 41 years. Adrian had taught him nothing. Bassetti had always known. He went to the desk in the bedroom. The small one, not the study, the one where he kept certain things that didn't leave the room, and he opened the top drawer and took out a phone he had not used in 14 months. Burner. Still charged, because he charged it the first Monday of every month the way a serious man maintained tools he hoped never to need. He powered it on, and while it loaded, he went to the window and looked down at the parking structure entrance 4 floors below, and he could see the dark shapes of the vehicles Dove had described, 3 of them, positioned in a way that was not accidental. The elevator was on the lobby level. He had maybe 4 minutes. He dialed the only number stored in the burner. It rang twice. A man named Ilya answered. Ilya was 70 years old, had been Bassetti's primary rival for 15 years before an arrangement was reached, and hated Bassetti with the specific focused hatred of a man who has made peace with someone he considers beneath him. Adrian had cultivated this relationship for 8 years as precisely the kind of insurance you hoped you'd never need to collect. "I need 48 hours, Adrian said. Ilya's voice was rough with sleep but sharpened immediately. He was that kind of man. What happened? Bassetti decided not to wait. A pause. Brief. Where are you? The penthouse. I need a car, a different building, and 48 hours for the legal documents to process before anyone decides to look at them. If I do this, Elia said, we are not even. We are past even. You understand what I'm saying? I understand. There's a parking structure on Fenwick, 2 blocks east of you. Gray Volvo, level B2, space 44. The key is behind the rear left wheel. A pause. 48 hours, Adrian, then you're on your own. The line went dead. He put the burner in his jacket pocket. He took the letter from the nightstand. He'd moved it upstairs at some point in the night, he didn't remember when, and put it in the inside pocket with the burner. He took nothing else. Not the phones, not the laptop. Not any of the accumulated evidence of Adrian Vescari's life in this building, because all of that was already compromised and any of it could be used to find him. And right now, being found by the wrong people before the settlement documents hit the courthouse system was the only problem that mattered. He went to the fire door at the end of the hallway, the one that opened onto the emergency stair that ran down the east side of the building, the same stairwell he'd told Dove to use, and he started moving. He came out at street level through a maintenance exit that opened onto an alley running parallel to Callaway, and the cold hit him immediately. The specific cold of 5 in the morning in late autumn, the kind that finds gaps in clothing and makes them personal. He moved east, keeping close to the buildings, not running because running changed the quality of your presence on a street, and right now he needed to be nobody. Needed to be the kind of man a security camera would record and a human eye would forget. 2 blocks. Gray Volvo, level B2. He found it in 40 seconds. The key was where Elia said. He sat in the car for a moment before he started it. Just sat. His hands on the steering wheel and the cold metal of the car around him, and the parking structure's fluorescent hum overhead. And he breathed. 3 measured breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The technique he'd learned from a man who was long dead, and had taught him the difference between fear and useful alertness. He was not afraid. He was alert. These were different states, and he knew the difference, and the difference mattered. He started the car. He drove. At 6:47, he was 40 miles outside the city on a state route heading north when his burner buzzed. Not a call. A text from a number he didn't recognize, which meant it was one of Elia's people relaying information through a sanitized channel. The message said, M is alive, hospitalized. They weren't there to kill. He read it twice. Marco was alive. They'd put him down, but not permanently, which meant Bassetti hadn't authorized a full termination, which meant this was pressure, not execution. A demonstration of capability rather than an endpoint, which meant Bassetti wanted him scared and compliant and willing to renegotiate on terms Bassetti set, rather than simply gone. He put the phone in the cup holder and drove and thought about this for 10 miles. Pressure was survivable. Pressure meant there was still something Bassetti wanted from him besides his removal, which meant leverage still existed in both directions, which meant the next 48 hours were not about running, but about maneuvering. He pulled off at a rest stop, sat in the lot, and spent 20 minutes on the burner making calls. Not to Aaliyah. To two other people in two other cities who existed in the same world he existed in, but owed their positions to arrangements that predated Bassetti's dominance, and would not be unhappy to see that dominance complicated. He did not threaten anyone. He did not ask for favors. He laid out information, accurate and specific, and he let the people receiving it draw their own conclusions, and then he asked a single question of each of them. If Bassetti moved to consolidate the Callaway operation under his own structure in the next 30 days, where does that leave you? The answers were informative. He drove north. At 9:15, he pulled into the parking lot of a roadside motel 2 miles off the highway, a place with a vacancy sign that blinked on the offbeat, and a front desk staffed by a woman of about 60 who looked at him with the incurious eyes of someone who has checked in every variety of human being and found none of them particularly surprising. And he paid cash for 2 nights, and she gave him a key on a plastic fob that said 7 and nothing else. The room was exactly what it was, functional, impersonal, carrying the faint imprint of every person who'd slept in it without leaving anything of themselves behind. He sat on the edge of the bed, and he called Strickland. "I need the settlement filed by 10 a.m., he said. "Not ready. Filed, in the system." Strickland didn't ask about the 5 a.m. silence, or the fact that Adrian was calling from a number he'd never seen before. This was also what you paid Strickland for. "That's tight. Can you do it?" "Yes." "Then do it." He paused. "When it's filed, send confirmation to Hartman directly. Not through me. I want Vivian to know it's done before noon." "Understood." A pause that almost contained a question, and then didn't. "Anything else?" "Not yet." He set the phone down on the bedside table and looked at the room. Water-stained ceiling. Curtains the color of old mustard. A television bolted to the dresser, which he didn't turn on. He reached into his jacket and took out the letter and unfolded it on the bed beside him and looked at it, not reading it again. He had it memorized now, every word in its exact position. Just looking at it the way you look at a thing that has become important to you for reasons you couldn't have predicted. At 11:43, Strickland sent confirmation, filed and served. Hartman had already acknowledged receipt. Adrian sat on the motel bed and felt something move through his chest that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite grief, and was maybe something that existed between those two states, in the place where you finally stop performing and just let the actual weight of something land. It was done. Whatever happened next, with Bassetti, with the restructure, with the operational fallout, the settlement was in the system, and Vivian had what she needed, and no amount of pressure from Bassetti or anyone else could reach into a federal courthouse filing and change that. It was done. He lay back on the bed. He stared at the ceiling. He thought about the next 48 hours and what they required, and then he let himself stop thinking about them for 10 minutes, which was a luxury he was going to allow himself exactly this once. He thought about the coast instead. 400 miles northeast. Cold water and salt air and small shops with weathered signs. A woman building a life out of the pieces she'd chosen deliberately. The way you build something when you've learned the hard way that what you let other people build for you will eventually be used against you. He thought about what it would take to become someone who deserved to breathe the same air as that kind of life. He thought it would take more than he currently had. He thought he was going to try anyway. The 48 hours passed in a particular way. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific texture of time that you experience when the future is genuinely uncertain and your body knows it and stays lit at a constant low level of alertness that doesn't burn hot enough to be fear, but doesn't go cool enough to be peace. He made calls. He waited. He ate gas station food and slept in 4-hour increments and watched the curtained light of the motel room change from day to night to day again. On the morning of the second day, something shifted in Bassetti's camp. He felt it before he heard it, a change in the quality of the silence from certain numbers that had been active the day before. Aaliyah's people stopped updating him, which meant the situation was no longer moving toward him. Then a call came from a man named Reyes, who operated in the southern end of the city's financial district and whose neutrality was the most expensive commodity he sold. And Reyes said, in his careful, measured way, that certain parties had concluded that a full consolidation move on the Callaway operation was going to generate more regulatory attention than it resolved, particularly now that a settlement was in the federal system with Vescari's name on it, and any sudden change in his operational status would prompt questions. The settlement had worked as armor in exactly the way Renata had designed it to work. Bassetti couldn't move cleanly now. The paper trail existed. A man who settled his divorce in a federal courthouse and then disappeared would generate inquiries that even Bassetti couldn't fully manage. The exposure was mutual. And Bassetti, at 71, after 41 years of survival, understood mutual exposure better than anyone. Reyes said carefully that certain parties were open to a conversation about revised terms for the Callaway restructure. Adrian said he was available to have that conversation. He drove back to the city on the second evening. He did not go to the penthouse. He went to a hotel on the east side, not Meridian, somewhere smaller, somewhere that wasn't connected to any name or number or account that Bassetti's people had been watching. And he checked in and he showered and he put on the only clean clothes he had, which were what he'd been wearing when he left and weren't much. And he sat in the hotel room and called Marco. Marco answered from his hospital bed, his voice carrying the quality of a man managing pain with considerable discipline. "I'm fine," he said, before Adrian could ask. "2 ribs, nothing structural." "I'm sorry," Adrian said. A pause. Marco didn't do well with apologies. He came from a tradition where receiving one gracefully was as awkward as giving one. "It's the work," he said finally. "No." Adrian said it quietly. "It wasn't your work. It was mine. And you paid for it." He stopped. "When you're out, there's something for you. I'll have Strickland handle the details. You don't work for me anymore, Marco. Not in the way you have been. What I have left isn't that kind of operation." Another pause. Longer. "What kind of operation is it?" "I don't know yet. Something smaller, something I can look at directly." He paused. "Something I can explain." Marco said nothing for a moment. Then, "The ribs will be healed in 6 weeks." Adrian almost smiled. "I'll be here." The meeting with Bassetti happened 4 days later in a neutral location. A law office in the financial district, lawyers present on both sides, the whole thing framed as a business restructuring discussion, which it was, beneath the surface, in the way that most things in Adrian's world were 2 things simultaneously, what they appeared to be and what they actually were. Bassetti looked exactly as he always looked, contained, patient, the stillness of a man who operates on a longer timeline than the people around him. He looked at Adrian across the table, and Adrian looked back. And between them was the full weight of 20 years and 1 very bad week, and a settlement filing that had made certain outcomes logistically complicated, and Bassetti was not a man who wasted effort on complications. The terms they reached were not what Adrian would have chosen. He ceded a significant portion of the Callaway operation, the part that had always been more Bassetti's than his, if he was honest about the origins of it. He retained the legitimate holdings, the real estate portfolio, the above-board investment structure. He signed agreements that formally separated him from 3 operations he'd been nominally running for years through layers of plausible deniability. When it was done, what remained was still substantial. It was also, for the first time in 20 years, something he could point to and describe without euphemism. He thought Vivian would have found that interesting. He thought about her a great deal in the weeks that followed, not with the desperate, searching quality of the days immediately after she left. That frantic deployment of resources against the problem of her absence, which had been about him and not about her, he understood that now. This was different, quieter. He thought about her the way you think about something that has changed you. Not constantly, not obsessively, but in the moments when you're doing something and you suddenly understand it differently because of what you've been through, and you want to tell someone, and you realize who that someone would have been. He kept her closet exactly as she'd left it. He understood this was not healthy. He did it anyway. He started giving money away, not as a strategy. not to generate goodwill or create obligations or build the kind of social capital that powerful men accumulate through philanthropy while calling it generosity. He did it because Renata had said she wasn't trying to burn him down. She just wanted Vivian to have a wall, and he sat with that for a long time until he understood what it meant to give someone a wall. And then he started looking around at who else needed one. He funded a shelter in the Fenwick district. He established a trust for families in 3 neighborhoods that his operations had, over the years, helped to destabilize in ways he'd never let himself fully account for. He showed up in person once to one of those neighborhoods. Not announced, not with cameras, not with any infrastructure of performance around it. And he walked through it, and he looked at it, and he didn't let himself look away from any part of it. He came home that evening and sat in the study and read Vivian's letter for the last time. Then he folded it carefully, put it in an envelope, sealed it, and put it in the top drawer of his desk. Not to preserve it, not to punish himself with it, because it had done what it needed to do and he didn't need to keep reading it to remember what it said. He would always know what it said. It was part of the architecture of him now, load-bearing, permanent, the kind of knowledge that doesn't fade because it's become structural. 1 year later, on an October afternoon, when the light had the particular golden quality of autumn at its peak, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look briefly significant before the season turns, Adrian drove 400 miles northeast. He didn't plan to approach her. He wasn't even certain why he went. Some combination of completion and compulsion that he couldn't cleanly separate. The need to know that she was real and whole and actually living the life the letter had pointed toward. That he hadn't destroyed her, that what he'd taken from her had been replaced by something she'd built with her own hands. He parked on the coastal road and he walked. The town was exactly as he'd imagined from the travel magazine page he'd found still on her nightstand. Small, weathered, the kind of place that has decided what it is and stopped trying to be anything else. Salt air, boats in the harbor, a street that ran along the water with shops on one side and the sea on the other. He found the bookstore in 11 minutes. It was small, a hand-painted sign. Books stacked in the window with a cat sleeping against one of the piles, indifferent and comfortable. Through the glass he could see the interior, warm light, mismatched shelves, the comfortable chaos of a place curated by someone who actually loves what they're selling. Vivian was at the counter. She was talking to someone, a woman, older, a customer by the look of it, leaning on the counter with the ease of someone who's had this conversation before and enjoys it. Vivian was laughing at something the woman had said. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh, the real kind, the one that starts somewhere below the chest and doesn't wait for permission, the one he hadn't heard from her in so long he'd forgotten what it sounded like. And hearing it now through a bookstore window from across a coastal street, after one of the hardest years of his life, did something to the inside of his chest that he had no vocabulary for and didn't try to name. She looked different, not physically. She was the same woman, same face, same hands that he recognized even at this distance in the particular way you recognize something you have known in total darkness. But the quality of her presence was different. She stood differently, occupied space differently, like someone who has stopped bracing against the next blow and has discovered, somewhat to their own surprise, that the world can be moved through without constant armor. She looked like herself, maybe for the first time since he'd known her. He stood on the opposite side of the street with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he watched her through the window for 2 minutes, maybe 3. The customer left, laughing about something as she went. Vivian turned back to whatever she'd been doing, straightening a display. Moving books from a cart to the shelf with the quiet rhythm of someone in the right place doing the right thing. He took 1 step toward the street, then he stopped. He stood on the pavement in the autumn light and he held very still and he felt the full weight of what he was about to do. Walk across that street, open that door, step back into the space around her. And then, with the specific clarity of a man who has spent a year learning the difference between what he wants and what is right, he understood. He had not come here for closure. He had come here to make sure she was all right. And she was more than all right. She was something he couldn't give her. And something she couldn't have found if she'd stayed. She was genuinely free, and the specific quality of freedom on her face was not a thing he could enter without diminishing. Some things you love well by leaving them alone. He had spent 20 years taking up space, filling rooms, converting everything around him to something in service of his needs and his empire and his appetites. He had done it to operations and neighborhoods and men who worked for him. And quietly, systematically, without ever using a raised voice or a visible act of violence, he had done it to her. He was not going to do it again. He stood on the street and he looked at her through the glass, his wife, the woman who had cooked his dinner on the worst night of her life and washed the dishes by hand and lain beside him in the dark and decided with complete silence and complete dignity that she was done. And he said goodbye to her without sound, without movement, without anything that could reach her. Then he turned and walked back toward the harbor. The sea was gray-green and cold and moving in its vast and different way, and he walked along the waterfront with his hands in his pockets and the salt air in his lungs, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not on his way to something, not managing anything, not building or protecting or acquiring or containing. He was just a man walking on a street beside the sea in October, breathing cold air, carrying the weight of what he'd done and what it had cost and what it had made of him. All of it. The full inventory. Nothing softened or excused. He did not feel good. He did not feel at peace. He was not trying to. He felt the cold and the weight and the October light and the knowledge that the woman in that bookstore was laughing with a customer and living her life in the clean open air of someone who had chosen exactly where she was. And that had not happened despite him. It had happened in some important and irreducible way because of what she had survived of him. And the least he could do with that knowledge was carry it honestly for the rest of his life and let it mean something in the way he moved through the world from this day forward. He reached the end of the harbor wall. He stopped. He looked out at the water. Behind him, up the street, a woman who had once been his wife was shelving books in a warm room with a cat in the window and sunlight on the water outside and a life she had built entirely on her own terms. And she was, by every measure he'd observed, precisely all right. And Adrian Vescari stood at the edge of the harbor in the October light, breathing, with the cold sea in front of him and everything he could not reclaim behind him and the rest of his life. Smaller, plainer, more honest than anything he'd ever built. Somewhere ahead, still unwritten, and he thought that perhaps this was the correct beginning for a man who had finally stopped lying. Not a good man yet, not even close, but a man who knew the difference now. And that he decided, that specific knowledge, held clearly and without flinching, with no one to perform it for, and no benefit to be gained from it, was the only kind of foundation that was actually worth building on. He stood there until the light changed. Then he walked back to his car, alone, and he drove home. N.